Hey, good day, everyone. My name is Shelley. I'm the director and founder of BCD Canada. I'd like to welcome you all here today. We have a very interesting talk about biochar in urban settings. And with us today is Melissa Leung and Dr. Suzanne Allaire, both from GECA Environment. And they're going to give a presentation, so we'll get to learn more about biochar. And so if you have any questions, we ask that on the bottom of the screen, you'll see a little chat link. If you could just click that on and then type in your questions, and then they'll address your questions at the very end of the presentation. Okay, so with that, again, I'd like to thank Melissa and Suzanne for joining us today, and we look forward to your presentation.
Awesome. Thanks, Shelley. So thanks for having us on BCity. It's a wonderful opportunity for us to kind of, spread the word about biochar. So my name is Melissa Leung, and I will be the one giving most of the presentation. Suzanne might interject at some point if she finds that, I forget something sometimes, or if she had other comments to make. And together we'll answer the questions at the end of the presentation. So I'll just start now. The topic today is biochar in urban settings, of course. So we're going to start talking about the residual organic matter problematic. So we're from Quebec in Canada, and there's going to be a law by 2020 that says that we can't landfill residual organic matter, or ROMs as we like to call them. So that might not be the case in every province, but regardless, in most of the states and in Canada, we have a lot of organic matter that's just landfill or incinerated, and that we feel at JECA that we can do something about that. We can, transform them. So about 30% here in Quebec are already recycled, either by, compost or other processes. But since this law is passing, the law already passed, since it's coming into effect in 2020, we need to divert about 70% from the landfill. So today we're going to talk to you about pyrolysis, and especially biochar, the product of pyrolysis, to really, find as a solution for this residual organic matter accumulation, either from urban or industrial sources. So we believe strongly that residues are not waste, but rather they are feedstock. We think that they take so much time, so much energy and money to make. So why would we waste all this by sending it to incineration or landfill? For certain residual, materials, pyrolysis is the best solution in those cases. But again, we want to really make it clear that we believe that there are other solutions than pyrolysis, and that at the end of the day, pyrolysis is one amongst others. Although we think the products that come from that are valuable. So products like biochar, pyrolytic oil, and wood vinegar are some of the things we talk about. Big question that comes up quite often is, what is the difference between pyrolysis and combustion? And I think it's important to make the distinction, because people think we're just lighting stuff on fire. Unfortunately, it's not that. Pyrolysis is actually a thermal transformation of residues between 300 and 900 degrees Celsius in the absence of oxygen. So in combustion, there is oxygen. And why does this matter is because when you're doing combustion, you basically, your products are going to be mostly gases, a lot of CO2, and all your carbon, most of your carbon from your feedstock, what you're burning in combustion, is going to be released into the atmosphere as, CO2 or CO2 equivalents. In pyrolysis, because we don't have this oxygen, we're not going to have a flame, we're not going to have combustion. Therefore, we will allow kind of a, we'll concentrate the carbon within a solid, which is biochar. Then we will also have, of course, some gases, energetic gases, and some liquid if we choose to condense those gases. So biochar is the main subject, of course, today. But I just wanted to say quickly that, different feedstocks, speed of pyrolysis, temperatures will make different products. So biochar, general characteristics. What is biochar? So it's a solid with a very high carbon content. Generally talking about over 60%, and it's stable carbon. This means that it won't be, degraded or released into the atmosphere. It has a half-life of hundreds to thousands of years even. And some characteristics that are quite general to biochars, but not found, I'd say, in every single one of the biochars because they're so variable. We'll name them here. We're talking about water retention by weight up to 200%. This is very important for certain applications. We're talking about low density. Again, very nice. We're going to mention some of those applications. Super high, well, it can have super high surface area, and it can also have low surface area. So it can go up to 200 meters square per gram. This means that for some types of biochar, 20 grams will equal football field, or well, for Europeans, an American football field. And also generally has very high energy content. Now in the chemical characteristics of biochar, we can generally find a higher pH. It's not generally acid, it's a bit basic, so between 7 and 10, there are some that will be lower or higher. Of course, cation exchange capacity between 8 and 200, that's important if we're talking about, I think, absorption and this kind of thing of, X or Y elements. Then we have a lot of micronutrients for plant. We're talking about, phosphorus, we're talking about potassiums, okay? But generally, we don't find a lot of nitrogen in biochar. And that's something to keep in mind for agricultural or horticultural purposes. And of course, there's some carbon that's soluble as well as stable. So overall, biochars have characteristics that resemble peat or wood charcoal. Wood charcoal is actually a type of biochar derived from wood, but you can have a biochar derived from any other, biomass feedstock. So we won't necessarily refer to it as charcoal, but rather biochar. So how can we use biochar in our cities to help pollinators? We're going to go across a bunch of applications, many applications, and we're kind of going to go a bit deeper into them. So this is an infographic that we did at JECA Environment to illustrate the potential markets for biochar. Now, once again, I want to be clear, not all biochars are going to be good for all of these markets. Specific requirements for certain markets, will entail that it can't be used in another one. So today, to talk a bit more pollinators and environmental applications, we're going to talk about biochar in soils, plants, for transformation, especially in compost. We're going to talk about filtration, carbon sequestration, and in materials. First, biochar in the compost industry. As I mentioned earlier, we believe that compost should be one of the first thing you do if, for example, you're dealing with food waste. And it's super important. It's great for, garden, agriculture, this type of application. However, sometimes, compost doesn't turn out so good. There are a bunch of environmental conditions that might be the cause for that. And usually if cities get bad batches of compost, they will send them to landfills. So it kind of defeats the purpose of reusing those wastes. So one thing we propose is that with bad compost, although it can't be used directly in garden, we can use it we can pyrolyze it basically and create some biochars. Now, the other side of the other thing we can do with biochar in the compost industry is we actually can add biochar within the compost itself. And that will generally allow, increase microbial diversity and quantity. Oh, there we go. And it will make the compost go faster. So the time it would take to complete a compost will be about 10 to 15% shorter optimally. So that's the kind of thing. And in, industries or even in cities that are doing huge amount of composting, this could really be a good advantage for them to have this quicker turnover. So that's for biochar in the compost industry. Now, in biochar in degraded sites, those are results that were found either, in scientific literature or by Suzanne's team at Laval University. So by using pyrolysis with the ROM within the degraded site, we get to create biochar. Now, the biochar and then the degraded site, if we put it in, then it brings life. as we like to say, because it increased, microbial growth. So the communities will be more diversified, and there will be actually higher quantities of microorganisms as well as mycorrhizae, and therefore encourage vegetation, plants, trees, etc. One thing that's really important for degraded sites is we will be able to do an extraction and retention of contaminants. Because biochar has, it can have high cation exchange capacity, we will be able to absorb some of, certain heavy metals or contaminants that can be found on site. So that's going to be really useful for, mining, yes, of course, but cities as well, cities who have contaminated sites because of previous industries that are trying to make this land, residential or parts. So this type of extraction can be done with biochar, and of course you can bring nutritive elements for plants. So overall, integrated sites will be we have better carbon balance. We will increase water balance and water quality by doing this absorption of contamination, and of course better the looks, because I don't know a lot of people who don't like plants, but I mean, it's possible. Now in horticultural and nursery productions. These are results, again, from Suzanne and her team at Laval University. And so I will tell you a bit more about it. They added to potting mix. So in the horticultural substrate, it can be inoculated or not with, fertilizers such as nitrogen, because I said earlier that there's not a lot of nitrogen content within the biochar itself. However, when you mix it with fertilizer or even compost, then the absorption capacity of the biochar will, allow it to retain those nutrients and act as a slow release fertilizer. That's one thing it can do. And then it can substitute certain really expensive or non-renewable products. We're talking mostly here about perlite or partly, not completely, peat moss. We can inoculate it with microbes, obviously, as well. So the effects that they observe in their research is that biochar has a really good water retention, so you don't have to, water your plants as often in your soil. You get better nutrient retention for plants. You increase aeration because it's very porous, it is light, and of course, beneficial mycorrhizae and microbe diversity in quantity. And at the end of the day, all of these, elements will create higher yields and more healthy plants. So this is an overview in horticultural production. So that's more agriculture. But now within the scope of, this webinar, we want to know what are the related urban application? How can we take this kind of research and result and apply it in our cities? So first things, golf courses. Many of you might, play golf. I don't personally play golf, but one thing that's constant in golf courses is that the grass is green and it has to be nice in order to attract people and to have, the best golfing experience possible. So within golf courses, we can use biochar as a slow release fertilizer, as I mentioned earlier, to increase soil health, increase water retention. And that's particularly interesting for golf courses that are not necessarily in areas that rain a lot. So in Quebec, it rains a lot, that's fine. But if someone is from California here, then water is expensive. It doesn't rain a lot. You have a certain quantity and then you have to pay for it. So having, an amendment that can retain water will reduce water costs and use, of course. So that could be significant. There are some that already did that before. Case studies might be online, I'm not too sure. And of course, it will induce grass growth, and ameliorate aesthetics. Just 1 second. Therefore, you have, greener, better, and more green, environmentally friendly golf courses. And so reduction of irrigation. Another application in urban settings is in city parks. We're talking about flower pots, flower beds. These pictures are just example, Central Park and somewhere in Japan. But more recently, we were at the Biochar conference in Colorado, in Fort Collins, Colorado. And in the old town, they had a lot of, flower pots hanging from poles or just on the side of buildings. And kind of in the horticultural setting, biochar can be used in those pots, obviously, as horticultural substrate to increase soil health, boost tree and plant growth, flowers, and sequester carbon. And what happens if you use it, biochar, in city parks and flower pots, flower beds, and you really encourage kind of, nature within the city, then you get to attract pollinators. And that's one of the reasons we're here today. Next, kind of still in the same horticultural setting, we're talking about green roof, green walls, urban agriculture. Now, here in the top right, the picture is actually the social science building, at the University of Ottawa. I put it there because that's where I studied, so it kind of reminded me of what I used to call home. But biochar can be super useful in this type of application because it is so light and because of its capacity to retain water. So, and also in green roofs or urban agriculture, you don't necessarily want to put a lot of pressure. Soil is quite heavy. You want to reduce that pressure on the either the wall or the roof, and absorb CO2. So biochar can bring soil microorganisms to thrive. It can increase soil structure, which is really important if we're talking about vertical, farming or vertical walls, literally. And at the same time, sustain urban pollinators. Now, of course, inside a building, you might not necessarily want a lot of bees or other pollinators, but on rooftops and in the city in general, I think it's super important. Now, in the fertilizer, how can biochar affect our fertilizer use? One thing that affects wildlife, including pollinators, is synthetic fertilizers, fungicide and herbicides. There's a lot of research that has been done. There's proof that all these chemicals that we put into the environment, it doesn't benefit the wildlife and the pollinators. It kind of hurts the environment a bit. So biochar can help reduce the need for synthetic fertilizer, reduce the need for fungicide and herbicide, and therefore decrease the impact on wildlife and pollinators. And why can it do that? It's because of its properties. By increasing micronutrients like P and K, you can reduce your synthetic or artificial input of those kind of nutrients within the soil. And then when it absorbs, nutrients, it can act as a slow release fertilizer. So instead of continuously using synthetic fertilizer every X time or even just decrease the quantity, we can do that with biochar. Then we can support beneficial microorganisms such as mycorrhizae and beneficial micro bacteria. That's what I mean. And at the same time, we can absorb CO2, which is really great because then you get to reduce greenhouse emissions. Biochar for media filtration. So on this point, it's out of the whole. We're not really in the plant and the green. How do I say, as a soil substrate anymore? We're really talking about air and water filtration. So within urban productions, within agricultural urban production, or just in your backyard, there are ways to use biochar. Biochar for media filtration can, decontaminate water, filter toxins, just reduce odors by taking out the cause of it. And often, one of the ways we can do that is by replacing activated carbon. Activated carbon is actually a type of biochar. However, it usually comes from very specific feedstock, and it's really expensive. We're talking really expensive. So by using biochar that's made from a residue, and that's a lot less expensive, then we can have a greener footprint. And something else to consider is that actually for some application, biochar is better than activated carbon. It has different properties, and those properties are modulable depending on what we're trying to do with the biochar. And activated carbon, it doesn't really act necessarily the same way. It has kind of one method of filtration or absorption, and biochar has more than one. So you can absorb or decontaminate better. So where can we use biochar for this type of application? We can use it in agricultural, urban agricultural production, for example, in cannabis. So it's a really new area here in Canada, but cannabis productions, they smell very strong. And what happens is that neighbors don't like that. They don't want the smell coming out directly. So producers are going to use activated carbon sometimes to filter their air. And, we can replace activated carbon with the biochar and really take out that odor that really kind of bothers people. Just as a precision, activated carbon is generally made from coconut. That was just, so it's a type of biochar, but it's only one type of biochar, and not always the best in certain situations. So we can also use it for water irrigation, irrigating water that is used. We can filter that at the end of agricultural production, and we can use it in aquariums, ponds, swimming pool, or in air purifiers. Basically, anything you kind of want to filter, you can most likely use biochar with it. Activated carbon, that's another subject, but sometimes it is also made from fossil coal. So replacing it with biochar or coconut-based activated carbon can really decrease the footprint for cities that use it in their building, for example, or in the gardens, or for an industrial, which is not the topic today. The overall message for media filtration is that the biochar that is used needs to be specifically designed or chosen for a particular application in order to have the optimal, effects, the optimal filtration. And that's really important because certain types of biochar will not have the properties to absorb certain contaminants or, be designed to reduce odors. And that's to take into consideration if you want to purchase it or use it. Biochar in water protection. We're talking here about buffer strips. Sorry, I forgot about the name. So buffer strips along rivers, we're going to use biochar in there to absorb contaminants. That's one part of it, but to decrease eutrophication. So when we absorb contaminants, we can also absorb certain micronutrients that are in large quantities. For example, phosphorus, there are a lot of problems in many lakes or rivers or estuaries where there is an increase in phosphorus that's leaching from agricultural production, as an example, and it's causing algae to grow in a huge amount and eutrophying water. So biochar can absorb, those excess phosphorus and therefore reduce the chances, at least, of eutrophication. We can also improve plant growth, of course, as we discussed, and therefore improve soil stability. We're talking about trees, especially because trees that grow on the side of rivers will have their roots in there and will contribute to a lot to soil stability and prevent erosion and that kind of thing. Buffer strips along surface water, this kind of thing. It is important to know, again, I want to make this clear with everyone, I might be repetitive, but biochar has to be designed specifically for a certain application. So if we were talking, for example, about absorbing phosphorus, it won't be just any biochar. Sometimes it actually has to be modified after its creation in order to have really the optimal absorption capacity for one particular micronutrient or heavy metal, for example. Going in a totally different direction, biochar use in materials. That's something that is gaining a lot of attention, and that's going to be important if we want to sequester carbon. So we're talking about materials such as plastic, concrete, cement, building materials, but not structural. I will explain why later. In certain cases, biochar can increase UV resistance. So if we're talking about, let's say, a bench, like the first image, I know this is metal, I just couldn't find, plastic bench that looked like plastic. But in a case of a bench outside or patio furniture, we really want to use biochar to increase that UV resistance and therefore have a longer kind of lifespan for that, for your patio set or for park benches. And at the same time, sequester carbon. Some biochar will also allow better flexibility in certain applications. I don't really have one at the back of my mind right now, but it can be really important. We can talk about, I guess, about chairs, patio chairs. You kind of want flexibility. Otherwise, it's kind of uncomfortable. Biochar can also, of course, give it this black color, but it is important to note that it's not necessarily going to be black. It will really depend on the concentration you're putting into it, and therefore sequester carbon. Something that I didn't write here, but Suzanne actually just messaged me about was some biochars can repel water and increase longevity, therefore, of outdoor plastics. So when we're talking about patio furniture or city chairs or benches in parks, garbage cans in parks, they're often made of this kind of plastic. It can be really important to increase their life and sequester carbon. So talking about carbon sequestration, some of you might not really know about it. I've mentioned it quite a bit. We're talking about carbon sequestration when we're preventing carbon from being released into the atmosphere under greenhouse gas emission. Generally, we're going to talk about CO2 equivalents, and biochar can help in three ways to reduce carbon emissions. The first way is by its production. So because we are using residual organic matter, we are preventing it from going to landfill. Landfill generally produce a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. So that's one way we help reduce our carbon footprint from residues. Second, we create really a stable carbon, and that stable carbon that it has 1,000 years perhaps of half-life will not go into the atmosphere, and when we sequester it in soil or materials, it can really help us and also not be released directly in the environment. Now, if we're talking about using it as energy, as burning coal, it's something else. That's why this second point is important to keep in mind, to sequester stable carbon within soil or material. So this type of application, we're not burning it. The third point is that biochar enhances growth of plants, as I've said many times today. So plants, especially when you think about trees, they're CO2 sinks. So by increasing or enhancing their growth, you're not only, with biochar, you're not only taking biochar that is stable carbon and sequestering it in the soil, you're also pulling out more carbon from the air so that the plant can live, the actual physical plant is made of carbon. So something that comes up quite often is price on carbon, the carbon tax. In Canada, some of you are not from Canada, but even in the States, there are some talks about the carbon tax. We basically want to put a price on carbon. Now, with biochar, it's a bit tricky. The US and the Canadian government don't recognize biochar for carbon sequestration, but it is done in Australia. I'm honestly not sure about certain European countries. But the main reason behind their, hesitation of considering, or not even hesitation, but lack of considering biochar as a way to sequester carbon officially, is really because of the math behind it. Because, as I mentioned, the properties are so variables, even just in the carbon content of the biochar as is, and then the application, and then the offsets or reductions in emissions due to its feedstock, whatever it is, the calculations are really kind of difficult, more difficult than other types of, carbon sequestrations, like just planting trees. You can calculate it quite easily. Biochar is kind of difficult. So that is one of the barriers behind using it officially as a way to sequester carbon. That being said, some people consider it, especially on the voluntary market. Biochar is getting more and more momentum and is getting considered for carbon sequestration. So the voluntary market, you and I, people just, anyone who kind of wants to decrease their carbon footprint can buy carbon credits from people, from platforms, but so do big corporations. And biochar, is really getting important in that point. And recently, actually, in Europe, I think it's a Finnish startup. It's a platform to trade carbon credits, and there is a supplier of carbon credits that is a biochar producer. So it's really, gaining visibility, and I think we're going to see it quite soon. But at the government level, here, at least in the US and Canada, it is not recognized. And I don't think in the next couple of years it will be. It will take longer than that. Oh, $1 million question, how much does biochar cost? It's very variable, again, like everything. 300 to 1,500 USD per metric ton, we're talking usually. Now, it's important to note, once again, that biochar are very specific, are very different from each other, and they have very specific uses depending on their properties. So some biochar would be good in, for example, in for potting soil and plants, but won't really be good for air filtration, just as an example. It's important at that point to really choose the proper biochar. And so the price vary because of the feedstock. There might be tipping fees or not. The producer might have to buy the feedstock. And then the technology, there would be a cost associated to running, the technology and buying the technology. And at the end, the processing. Is it transformed? Is it in granules? Is it, powder? So everything comes in play. But so depending on your application, it might be different. Higher, more costly applications are generally filtration of air or water, just as an example. And then at the bottom here of the slide, you can see that we just went and grabbed really any kind of biochar we could find on the retail packaging. For 1.15 kilogram, it's $20. Now, for a home gardener, that's great. That's fine. You can pay that. You can just put it in, your garden, your pots, even in your house. However, if you're, a agricultural producer, or if you are working somehow in business and would like to integrate biochar within the business or within the city, if you're buying big quantities, that is not viable. You can't pay $17,000 per ton. And if you do, give me your secret, honestly. So where can we find it? We can find biochar in bulk and retail size, just like I just mentioned. In bulk, you can contact us, JECA Environment. That's part of what we do. We work with consumers to find the specific biochar they need for a certain application. So we will evaluate, goal, constraint, budget, tonnage, all this kind of thing to really find suitable product for you. And if not, sometimes we actually work with customers to design your biochar for a certain application. So for example, in your city, if you have a problem with a really specific contaminant, then we might be able to help you develop a biochar that will absorb this contaminant specifically. Another way to get biochar in bulk is online on pyrolysis.com. For those who don't know, Pyrolysis is an online platform that we created, JECA Environment created, and it's kind of a Craigslist or Kijiji. It's dedicated to the pyrolysis and torrefaction industries, and you will be able to find biochar on there from almost all corners of the world. So that's that. We don't filter the ads. Like I said, it's kind of a Kijiji. So you kind of have to know what you're looking for and what is good, what kind of biochar is good for your application. Now in retail size, we also have some on Pyrolysis, but some sites like Amazon or even producers have them on their own website where you can buy them. But it's mostly for agricultural and soil applications. Again, the message, I think the most important message in this whole presentation, it really is the application will dictate the properties needed for the biochar. And it's important as, business or cities to really assess the needs when we're talking about biochar and what kind of goal there is to use it, because then you can really target your approach and select the optimal biochar for you. So I just want to say in general that biochar can really help, I think, bee cities, and it's a great tool to, promote growth, promote the nature and environment within cities. I put this picture, the top right picture. I know it's a bit small, but you get the gist. It's actually a bus stop. I think it was taken in the Netherlands, if I'm correct. And it's a bus stop, and on top of it, they put flowers. And I think it was really a great, visual for how we can implement nature, flowers, plants, trees within our cities. And of course, biochar is great for that type of application because it's light, it has high water retention. You've just heard it all before. But by bringing all this vegetation within our cities, then we can sustain our pollinators. And that's going to make a difference, of course. So just want to thank Bee City Canada for this really great opportunity. I think it's really nice. And for those who are watching live, you can type your questions right now. We'll try to answer it, Suzanne and I, as much as we can with the time we have left. And for those who are not watching live, this will be, this is on YouTube, and it will be free, accessible to everyone. So that's pretty much it. Thanks for, listening. I know it's a lot of information. It's quite long, but yeah. So now Shelley, you can go ahead and say what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Melissa. That was a fantastic presentation. What a great overview, but what an incredible product biochar is.
Yeah.
Uh, so, does anybody have any questions? I mean, if you'd like to type it in, or if you'd like to unmute, if you feel more comfortable just asking the question, please go ahead. All right, so I have some questions here. So let's say a city wants to get started. What would they do? What do you recommend that a small town, let's say 50,000 people or 60,000 people, how could they start looking into this process?
So I think it really depends what they're looking to do. I think that's the most important point. If they're looking to, use biochar in their parks, then I think we kind of have to assess the needs of the soil and find a biochar that's suitable for that. Or if they want to implement in any other way, it really depends on the application. I think that's the biggest take-home message. So one thing they can do is they can come to us, talk, a bit about their application, what they're trying to do. And what we do, part of what we do at JECA is, as I said, we assess their needs. And if we have to find a very specific biochar or help create a very specific biochar, we will work on that with them in conjunction with the producer. Suzanne, I don't know what you want to add on this.
Yeah, there are different steps. The first step is to define what they want to do. This is their objective. Their budget, and once we understand the budget for spending, we can also help them to understand how much they can decrease their budget by using biochar as well. So how much they can save by using biochar. We can assess if there are some biochar producer close to their area, and look at the quality of the biochar for their objectives, and see if this respond to the objective, and so we can support on how much they can use, how they can use it, and otherwise we can go ahead outside of their cities and outside of, let's say, their province, and find the right biochar for them. We can also help them to if they have a promoter, we can find the right technology for them to make biochar from their local residues, that they can that the residues that they don't transform into compost, or they don't make digestion with it, whatever residues they have left and don't know what to do with, then we can help them to transform that into biochar.
So there's a question from Mike. How hard is it to have new biochar technology into Canada? Are the regulations tough?
I will answer that. Sorry. Technology, there are a lot of technologies that exist out there that respect regulation in Canada. But from one province to the other, it is different. Some province, the legislators are more educated about pyrolysis, and so it's easier to go and get the technology and get the permit. In other places, they need more education, so it takes longer to get approval, but they do get approval. We have a lot in Quebec. We have all over Canada, we have a pyrolysis system, except in New Brunswick, I believe. So it exists, is out there, and we can have the permit. It takes between 1 and 2 years to get a permit.
I think one other thing I would add to that, Suzanne, is that some, pyrolysis technology, therefore making biochar, they can be, huge plants. We're talking about industrial size, but there are also some technologies that are a lot smaller that can fit in one room. For example, grocery stores, they have a lot of residues, for example, so there's a scale, and the scale is big. So depending on the size, of course, of that kind of machine, I feel like the regulations are different. Yeah.
Yes, below 10 ton per hour, usually the regulation is much easier to get. And so we do have in Canada some manufacturers that respect those regulations as well.
Yeah. So we also help companies, in their project development to find the right technology depending on their needs. That's also kind of what we do. Basically, we do a lot in that field. Lorraine asked, can this be used in houseplants? Of course, of course. It's the biochar works best in not, how can I say that? Biochar works best in kind of poor soils, but it's never gonna hurt a plant. So if you're using biochar, for example, outside in the summer, I know, I live in Quebec City and we didn't have that much rain this summer. So if I were to use biochar in my, my planted plant in a pot, it will retain more water if I choose this biochar correctly. So of course it can be used for houseplant. We put biochar in all of them. One thing that's important, if you do decide to put biochar in, your potting soil, you kind of must respect the user guide depending on the biochar you buy, because you can't just put a lot of biochar. That's not necessarily going to be the best way to use it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, one of the reasons is because of pH. Plants are sensitive to pH. If you put a biochar of pH 7 and your plant require pH 5, well, it's gonna grow, but it's not gonna be optimal. If you put a biochar at pH 10, which exists, you cannot put a lot in your potting soil because pH 10 is, I don't know any plants that like that pH. So we have to be careful about how much we put, and so as Melissa said, it's important to follow the recommendation. But now more and more potting soil mix will contain biochar. So we see that the larger, smaller companies that make potting soil for everybody or for commercial and application, it's coming on the market in Canada. We don't see much yet, but it's coming.
I will say this, I'm pretty sure some already sell them. Carbon Gold is based in the UK and they sell biochar for it. Air Terra, the kind of the image I put in the slide, they sell the biochar for that specific purpose. So I'm guessing if you buy some of that, retail packaging biochar just for your garden or house plants, you'll have it'll tell you how to use it, kind of the dosage. Probably going to say like 1 cup for, I don't know, 10 liters or kilograms of soil. I don't know, don't take that as an answer, but it's going to give you directions on how to use it if you buy it on retail scale, pretty sure.
And by the way, Airterra is an Alberta-based company.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's Miracle Grow also have in Europe, Miracle Grow has a potting soil that contains biochar as well. But there are others in the United States, and you can find some in eBay and Kijiji and other places. But mostly you can go on pyrolysis as well, trying to find some biochar as well.
Okay, Suzanne, this is going to be for you. What role does particle size distribution play in the specific design of biochar? And does the raw material play a role in the design of the biochar?
First, the feedstock is always super important because the feedstock, it depends, the feedstock influence the porosity and thus will influence the absorption capacity, will influence the water movement, air movement, etc. And it also influences the micronutrients that we find. If we think about plant growth, for example, micronutrients will be very important. For air filtration, it's going to be the porosity and the absorption capacity. So the feedstock influence all this. And then we have the temperature that we will play on to modify the properties of the biochar. And then what was the second question?
Well, the first question is, what does the particle
the particle size,
size distribution play in specific design of biochar? What role?
Yeah, particle size for some application is important, and for other application is much less important. Particle size, for example, if you want to do a carbon sequestration in forest soil, we don't really care about particle size. However, if we want to do water and air filtration, it's just very, very important, as well as potting soil. So particle size, if we make with plastic as well, they have very specific, it's very narrow range of particle size that they can use for specific plastic and other application like that. So it's super important, but we could precondition before pyrolyzing, and we can also modify the particle size afterward as a post-conditioning treatment.
Okay. Michael asked, I think this is the last questions, but please, if you have more questions, just ask them away since we still have, 15 minutes to go. But so Michael asked, what is the good feedstock? And more importantly, what is a bad feedstock?
For what? For what application?
It really depends. One thing I will say, I think, is in the scope of what we kind of are presented today, the biochar will be made from organic, biomass. But when they're mixed, when it's contaminated or mixed, it's not necessarily the best feedstock. But as Suzanne said, it really depends on the application. If you're just trying to sequester carbon or in soil forests, as she said, then you can use straw and whatever feedstock. But if you're trying to do air filtration, then you're going to need, as she said, specific properties that might not be found in every feedstock. So it's really, I think it really depends. The most important point to consider is the final use of this biochar. What is it? And then from there, we can work our way back and find the best biochar for that use.
That's very well said. I would I would say that there is no bad feedstock, there's no bad biochar. We always have to combine the right biochar for the right applications. So if there's a feedstock that is highly contaminated with organics, well, during the process of pyrolysis, all the organics, the volatile, like the oil, and tar and those kind of things will be eliminated during pyrolysis. At the end, the biochar will have none of it. If it is contaminated with heavy metals, if the feedstock is contaminated with heavy metals, for example, the biochar will have almost all of it. It's not going to go into the gas or the oil. Well, for some of them, yes, but most of it will be accumulated and concentrated in the biochar. Then what do we do with the biochar that is concentrated with heavy metals? There are some applications that are interested to have zinc and copper, for example, for high conductivity, high electric conductivity, and other applications. So it's really, there's no bad biochar. It's really the right use for the right biochar.
Mm-hmm. Is it possible to measure the carbon sequestration? So I kind of touched about it earlier. It is possible. Puro has done it. Puro, I will actually type their website. 1, 2, 3, 4. I think, let me go grab it. Puro is an online platform, and it's quite new, and it's to trade carbon credits. And they've been, they actually have biochar in their calculations for selling carbon credits, which not a lot of people or platforms or governments have. So it's Puro Point Earth. So it is possible to measure carbon sequestration, but there are so many variables. So you kind of have to have an analysis of the biochar, of course, and of course measurements of the application. If you're just taking 1 ton of biochar with, I don't know, let's say 60% carbon, then you have 60% of that 1 ton will be carbon. If you just putting in a cement block, then it's easy to measure. But in other kind of concept, especially in agricultural soil, then it's different because you get more microorganisms sometimes, and it's just there. And then you have to measure also the feedstock. So from the feedstock, what are you how are you sequestering carbon by using residual matter instead of, virgin, and then, emissions and transport. And so it's quite complicated, but it's doable, and it's done right now.
Well, there are specialists of that. We do have one specialist in this at the University of Quebec in Chicoutimi, for example. There's a share on carbon, on boreal carbon. Some of them, it's not that easy to estimate because we need standards, and the standards in Canada and United States are not out yet. And so biochar for carbon sequestration is right now on a voluntary basis on the carbon market. So it's not on a legislation basis right now because we don't have official standard to estimate it in soil and agricultural applications. But the way to measure it, it's not a problem. The problem is to get the standard, and they have difficulties to define the standards because the biochar can be made from different feedstock with different properties.
Yeah, exactly. In Australia, they've recognized, I think, some types of biochar within soils as carbon sequestration. So that's official. And I think, Suzanne, you said the COP organization, I can't remember which number we're at, but they recognize biochar to sequester carbon. Then, so if they do that, it's an international organization, you know, then we hope that countries are going to follow quite soon. But as Suzanne said, it's the legislation and the standards for the countries. It's really difficult if we're talking about, you know, in soil application, especially if you're talking about using residues. Well, it could be contaminated wood residues. It can be, you know, virgin fibers, but it can also be, you know, sludge or manure as feedstocks. So that kind of influences their, let's say, their speed for making biochar a carbon sequestration tool officially. Okay, so there's not really any other questions. If you do have some, please ask them and we'll answer them. We still have kind of 10 minutes. But if you don't have some, then I think that will be it. Unless, Suzanne, do you have something to add?
Well, yes, thank you for being there today, and all those that will come later that will look at the YouTube as well. We hope that it helps to understand how biochar could play a role in BCDs. And also, don't be afraid to look for biochar. There are some places where you can kind of easily find them, but as we said, we have to be careful on how to use it because it's not a snake oil. It works, but we have to use the right biochar at the right dosage to help plant grow and pollinator in the cities.
Yeah, so that's really our final word. It's choose the right biochar for right application.
Okay, well, again, thank you both so much. It was an excellent presentation. Certainly a lot to know about biochar. And so as I said, this will be recorded, and we'll have, if it's okay, we could have your contact name, your contact information if people have questions.
Of course. My contacts were already on the last slide of the presentation. I think I can just send your last slide to you if you want.
Yeah, that's fine. Well, as I said, we'll send out an email to everyone again,
yeah.
And with the contact information. And
can use my contact. Yeah, that's good.
Okay, very good. Okay, so
just one point though. We want to promote the biochar, the right use. But we probably will wait for several questions to respond them as a whole, as a bunch, rather than responding every single individual inquiries, because it's going to be easier for us to respond.
Yeah. So Shelley, if you do get questions that might be directed to us, but they send them to you, then you can just send them. And then when we will get questions, I think we're going to accumulate a bunch of questions and perhaps do, you know, a video, so a little short video to answer them, whereas Suzanne and I can actually, you know, speak and give examples to everyone, make it available so that it doesn't take as much time and that we can educate more people and raise awareness to more people.
Yeah, I think I'm just thinking now that we could put it on our resource part of our website as well about biochar, and then again have a link to your website as well. So that might be an easy way. Not everybody looks at the YouTube channel. Okay, well, with that, thank you again. Thank you so much for your time and wonderful presentation. I know everyone has enjoyed it. Yeah, and they're all, a lot of people are quite interested in the product. Okay, thank you so much.
Great. So thank you again, everyone. And Shelley, of course.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting us.
Pleasure. Thanks again. All right.
Have a great day, everyone.
Bye-bye.